Fantastic to have everyone here from all over the country, around the globe there. Good morning, good afternoon, good evening to all of you there. Thank you for joining this, our webinar on the IRIS 2020 Xtreme from the Cyentia Institute with our special guest, Varric Videla of Visible Risk. I'm David Seversky. I'm a data scientist here at the Cyentia Institute. I'm one of the lead authors of this report, and I'm joined here today by my colleague, Wade Baker.
Hello, everyone. Glad to be here and really excited to talk about this report.
Fantastic.
Thanks, David. Derek Vidala. Thanks for having me here. CEO of Visible Risk, joint venture between Moody's and Team 8 focused on cyber ratings and financial impact of cyber risk.
Fantastic. So we expect that many people that have joined us that have saw our tweets and have checked out the IRIS Xtreme report have already read or seen or heard of the IRIS. If you haven't, that's okay. We'll bring you along for the ride there. If you are just coming new to the IRIS series, we encourage you to check us out at the cyentia.com/IRIS link. That's at the bottom of the screen. Where you can find both the original IRIS 2020 report as well as this brand new IRIS Xtreme report. They're all available for free with no registration there. So our agenda today, we'll be talking through some of the key findings of the IRIS Xtreme, as well as what this means for risk managers and risk practitioners of all sorts. As we go into this there, I'm going to go ahead and stop video there. We'll bring back video there at the end for the Q&A there. But for now, we're just going to rely upon slides. So I'll see you there. You'll continue to hear my dulcet tones. And let me get this set up. There we go. Fantastic. Okay, so a little bit of basic housekeeping before we get started, because people always ask, yes, this session is being recorded. We hope to post this for future playback. So if you miss this there, or if you have colleagues that are interested in this and the content we talk about today, stay tuned. We'll be broadcasting information about where to retrieve this in the future. In addition, the slides as well will also be posted. So if you are not interested in hearing our delightful color commentary, just want to get to the meat of the matter there, those slides will also be posted. We are offering Q&A. Since there are multiple of us and we have a lot of ground to cover there, we're going to be taking Q&A at the end. We encourage you to use the Zoom Q&A tab to submit your questions. Once you're there, you can either comment on questions submitted by other attendees. You can even vote questions up and down. We hope to get through as many of those questions as possible at the end of today's presentation. If there are any that we don't get to, or if you come up with questions later on, we encourage you to submit your questions now, and we will follow up much like we did for our IRIS 2020 series with a blog post detailing all those questions. So with that, let's go ahead and get started. So I mentioned we're using this metaphor of a safari. We're looking for the cyber events and what can we learn from there. But we'll start this by, well, what is the IRIS overall? Well, the IRIS is the information, our itinerary for this is to talk about what is the IRIS, to introduce you to Xtreme, and then to examine what these extreme events mean in the wild, and then what can you learn from these extreme events. So a little bit of background, what is the IRIS? The IRIS is the Information Risk Insight Study, IRIS. This is a study we've been really excited to work on starting back in May of this year when we first released the IRIS 2020 report there. We're targeting information risk managers and analysts of all sorts. There is a lot of information out there from ourselves, from other vendor partners out there, from other researchers talking about information on threats and defenses. There's not a lot of great hard quantitative data on the rate and outcomes when those controls actually fail. Looking at things from the lens of after the effect, the post-mortem perspective, what can we learn from this lost data? Here at the Cyentia Institute, we are strong advocates of quantitative risk management, and we are trying to arm risk practitioners with actual data to replace anecdotes with data. There's a lot of information about that back and forth parley between attackers and defenders, but there's not a lot of information up until IRIS has come out on the loss side of the risk equation. And again, our goal here is to replace the supposition and uncalibrated guesswork with some more data-driven informed priors. So what is the IRIS family? We started off in May of this year with the IRIS 2020 report, where we looked at 10 years of public events. I think about 50,000 of those publicly discoverable events. And we used that to generate estimates of probability for discoverable breaches across industry and across size of organizations. At the outcome of that, we had much improved loss tables for risk practitioners. We were able to show that some of the common metrics used for a static cost per record are really worse than useless when it comes to measuring breaches. And we actually gave some better results for the frequency of these publicly discoverable events, as well as the magnitude of these events. Now, when we're talking about the IRIS 2020 reports, we're talking about what are the typical events. So you can think of these as your house cat size breach. These are the things that most people come across when they actually have one of these publicly discoverable events. If we switch into the Xtreme report, however, we're looking at the big cats, the lions and tigers and bears, if you will, of loss information. We're focusing on the things that come across very strongly in the media, things that capture attention. We're trying to say, are there unique things on these extreme events? So first of all, we have to define what is an extreme event. So to do this, we were seeking out to get about approximately 100 of these noteworthy events. So we started with a population of IRIS 2020 events, and we looked for what is a reasonable threshold that will give us enough events that we could do a really deep dive into and actually get into the nuts and bolts of what happened, who did what on those actions, and figure out much more detailed than the very high-level information that we did for the IRIS 2020. And to do that, we had to figure out what are some filters. So we came up with a set of criteria that actually happened to be quite serendipitous, and that we first looked at everything with a financial loss of 20 million events or $20 million or more. These are things that have publicly verifiable losses from response costs, et cetera, of $20 million or more. So these are large events. But we realized that getting to loss information is really hard to do for some of these events. Sometimes we see a mega breach, something that gets a lot of media attention, a lot of coverage from the security press, but there's not a lot of information about the actual hard dollars involved. So we needed to get something else as well. And for that, we chose records that are at risk or exposed of 20 million or more. So we came up with, very serendipitously, we didn't plan it this way, this 2020 motif yet again, of $20 million or more of losses, or 20 million records. And that gave us actually 103 of these mega breaches, or these extreme events, starting from 2015 on to the end of 2019. Now, the question may come up, why did we not cover any events of 2020? You may be thinking of some events that occurred at the beginning of the year that may be noteworthy. Well, there's a reason for that. If you go back to the work that we did in IRIS 2020, we uncovered that from the time that an event actually first occurs, the date of breach on an organization, there is a lag of anywhere from 6 months or more before we start seeing all the events of this show up in press and lawsuits and SEC filings, et cetera, there. And we didn't want to capture partial information on some of these there. We hope to come back to those events that are occurring both in 2020 and some of those older events in future work. So let's get started. If we look at the events of what we covered in IRIS 2020, you might remember this chart. So this gray chart is what we saw in IRIS 20, which is the distribution of losses across all 50,000 plus publicly discoverable events. And you may remember that a typical, and I'm using air quotes around this there, event from a publicly discoverable event is about $200,000 in losses. This is that rough, what is a publicly discoverable breach going to cost my organization? If you have nothing else to use, that $200,000 is a great place to start at. Now, if you look at the lower end of that spectrum of what we used for the extreme events, you are looking at something that is 100 times that amount. These are events with losses over $20 million. That represents about 8% of all the losses that we were looking at in the in the IRIS 2020 data set there. I think that's about roughly 1.5 standard deviations there. So this is really the edge of the spectrum, the edge of the tail of the losses from that event. So once we had these events selected, we then had to actually do research. And Xtreme is a new opportunity for us. And it's definitely new in my experience of working with Cyentia. And we actually had to go out and actually find data. We actually had to mine it out rather than working with a known provided data set or working with multiple data sets and bringing them together. We actually had to go out and mine publicly available resources to find out what had happened for every single one of these events. This was a very intensive process, and we used a lot of different findings for this. We started with the Advisen cyber loss feed. We are delighted to continue to have a relationship with Advisen to work with their feed of cyber loss data. It's what we used for the IRIS 2020, and it was the starting point for what we did for Xtreme. We then went beyond that to say, where can we get additional information about the causes of this? By looking at things like SEC filings. So many of you may be familiar with, there are requirements now for US publicly traded firms that when you have a material breach, and there's some question about what material is defined as, you have to report that to your stakeholders and your shareholders. We use that information to figure out how are companies actually talking about these breaches they've expressed. We also looked at things such as Google News trends, try to figure out, are there changes in media attention of firms before, during, and after a breach response? Of course, there's all of the common news media, the mainstream news, as well as specialized news sources such as security researchers, their reports, their case studies, et cetera. And then, of course, we also looked at what are corporations saying themselves outside of what they're saying directly to investors. How are they responding in terms of PR announcements, their corporate briefings, et cetera? So from all those sources, what kind of facts did we uncover? So for every one of those 103 events, we looked to obtain as much of up to 200 data elements on every single one of these events. Again, we're looking across public data sources, and we're looking for a lot of data. It's not always available for all events. Unfortunately, we don't have full forensic information on these public breaches, and paradoxically or strangely enough, many organizations don't choose to publish full forensic reports on their breaches. But there's still a lot of information we can get from an overall perspective about, is there a campaign involved? Is it involved in some sort of mass infection or mass crime wave event? Is this involved in who is the actor? We have a lot of fondness for the Varus taxonomy here at Cyentia. We have strong connections with the folks over at Verizon and the open source Varus schema. So we also look for actors as well. What is the category of actors that we have? What kind of variety? Where are they coming from? What are they after? And then what did they do? You know, what is the action that they're doing? What is the vector by which they are actually making these initial forays into organizations successful? Something new is we're also trying to map this to attack framework as much as possible, with mixed success so far, but it's a very interesting prospect. Then we look at what are the actual assets that are involved, the category of assets, the amount, number of records, number of servers, et cetera. Of course, the all-important technical impact, which talks about the data type that's being involved, the number of records, et cetera. The financial impact, which is the dollars that are actually involved and what type of dollars are involved. We get into, as much as possible, several different types of lost data information on the financial impact. And we're also looking at soft indicators of impact, things that may not be directly measured in dollars and cents. This could include board changes, personnel changes at an executive level, in a worst case, organizational bankruptcy or even extinction. Are there indicators of poor incident response handling, or are there governmental hearings that result from one of these events? And of course, we're also looking to get information on the overall response timeline. When did the event actually occur? When did the organization first detect it? When were the major milestones of response all the way on through? And then, of course, for many of these major events, there's some sort of litigation involved. Are there cases involved? Are there fines and judgments? Are there class action suits? Or are they individual? Or are the regulators involved? So with all of that, this was a major effort there, and we have a lot of information that we can show. Our intention here is to show some highlights on this. We'll show a few sneak peeks of information, but let's get down to actually what can we learn from examining those extreme events in the wild. I'll turn it over to you, Wade.
Thank you, David. Hello, everybody. So the first thing here that you might think, well, how common are these extreme events, right? Is this something that happens all the time? And we've already shown that it's fairly rare. It's the end of the tail in that loss distribution that David shared with you. But from a year-over-year perspective, what are we looking at? And you can see from this chart that it's maybe half a dozen to a dozen at most extreme events that we know about. And again, this is everything that we're aware of or that we could find. And this kind of surprised me. I have a sense, because I'm probably more in tune with disclosures and things like that. I thought it would be more than this, but in the grand scheme of things, these extreme events are relatively rare, at least the public knowledge of them, right? And I will say that we had a lot of discussion about, how representative are these events and those kinds of things. And we all agreed that the larger an incident is, the larger the losses get, the larger the number of records that are compromised, the more likely it is to become public. So the chance of some major event not becoming publicly known, there's a chance, but these are the ones that tend to be flushed out into the public domain. When you look at this and ask the question of, are these trending up and down? Maybe if you kind of squint and add a trend line in your mind, you can kind of see that there seems to be an increase perhaps in frequency over 2018 and 2019. So maybe these extreme events are getting a little bit more common, or maybe our knowledge of them is becoming more common, but definitely something we want to watch over time as these progress. But give you a few points there. Final thing I'll show about this slide before we transition is NotPetya. You're going to see lots of stats as you read through this report, as you listen to us today. NotPetya was a major influencer in this. This was definitely a unique event. You see that spike there, and you will see the presence of those events felt as we dissect the losses and types of events and other things. Another thing you probably want to know as you get started on this little excursion are just who is involved. I am not a fan of naming and shaming in breach disclosure. I think it is a shame that that seems to be what disclosure is based on. Let's name the organization and let's show how irresponsible they were. I would much prefer we, highlight these events and we say what happened and what went wrong and how can we improve in the future. But be that as it may, I know that everyone has these events in mind, and it's the Facebook breach or the whatever. So here's a list. On the left, you've got the top 10 loss events by total loss. So Facebook was the largest loss event that we were able to find, and we found 5.1 billion in losses associated with that, and it just more than doubles anything else. And you can see it drops pretty quickly, but quickly by the time we get down to 10 Maersk, we're at 300 million. Still a huge event, but of course much smaller than the $1 billion losses that are above it. On the right of this slide, these are the largest losses as a proportion of revenue, or as a multiple of revenue, rather. So in this list, the losses are less, but look at that revenue multiple. We've got many times annual revenues that is represented by these losses. And this is kind of an interesting thing, and I'm gonna turn it over to Derek here in a moment. But if you notice, you probably are well aware of the firms on the left You've heard of those breaches, you know those firms. I bet you haven't heard of many of the firms, certainly some of them, but they're less known and they tend to be smaller. And that was one of the things we really wanted to try to flush out in this research is not only the dollars of impact that we could quantify, but all the other types of costs and impact. And that's why it was awesome working with Visible Risk on this research, because they brought a lot of that knowledge to bear as we turn to collect data and analyze the data and interpret the data. And so, Derek, I'll turn it over to you, and I know you have some things you want to share about these losses.
Yeah, thanks, Wade. I think, when we start to think about the losses as a percent of revenue, that's to me where this starts to get pretty interesting from a business perspective. And I think when you look at this, there's a couple of interesting points, which is the financial impact of these losses. A big portion of these events were not that significant in terms of the short-term impact, and then by definition, the long-term impact. So if you just look at this chart, it's not until we start to get to at least the midpoint between the 1% and the 10% mark, where you have things that start to trigger materiality, and you start to think about, is there a short-term impact, meaning, the subsequent calendar year or subsequent 12 months, and is there a more existential impact, meaning, 2 to 3 years out? And I think, we're still just seeing a small number of total events here, and because of that, some of the drive toward, is it a material event? Is it an existential risk or event? We're still not seeing that happen in many, many cases. And I think, inside the data, the truly existential events in these cases, I think, tended to be more focused on things like cryptocurrency exchanges or cryptocurrency businesses, where there was just such a material event that the impact was the company was out of business, and you don't see that with more traditional businesses typically. So that was pretty interesting for me. I think that is a key takeaway here. And then, on the next slide, I think what also is pretty interesting, more so than the pure revenue impact, is the loss beyond dollars, right? So there are impactful outcomes here that aren't necessarily a strong tail impact from a revenue perspective or a profitability perspective, but do have pretty significant personal impact for people that are working at these companies or governing these companies, and do have pretty significant impact in terms of regulatory oversight and inquiry. So if you look at just, let's just take executive churn and government inquiry, which I think are generally speaking pretty closely related. What we're essentially seeing here is that roughly a quarter of the companies in the data set had executive churn and or government inquiry. And I think that is pretty important, because when you think about what board directors and senior business executives, C-suite, are really concerned about, it's things like, one, what is the personal impact to me and my brand and my continued ability to work at the executive level or be on a board, and what is the impact overall to the company from a government and regulatory oversight perspective. And that can have, obviously that has personal impact to the individuals affected, but it also can have long-standing impact on expenses, because if you've gone through this particular event, maybe you were not a company that had a lot of compliance requirements, you surely are going to have more overhead for things like regulatory compliance in the future as a result of undergoing this event and ending up in a government inquiry or worse. And we've seen that when you look at the largest events where there was, where we're not talking about cases like NotPetya, but more individual cases where that is the impact, and that ultimately is where you start to see things like impact of financial stability or credit. And so lots of research happening in that space at Moody's to talk about what is that intersection. And then finally, I think there's an interesting observation on SEC disclosure, which is on the next page. And what's interesting here to me is it's pretty staggering to see the large number of events that just don't mention the incident in SEC filings. And I think if you look back to the updated guidance from 2018, it feels pretty clear to me that more needs to be done there. I don't think that guidance, that updated guidance, which was a further update from other guidance on disclosures that I think was almost a decade ago now. It's not really having an impact in a significant way. I think that's probably because the rules talk about materiality, and I think it's very easy to move around the materiality threshold simply because we don't necessarily know the full impact of an event until, in some cases, years after it occurs. So I think that might be a pressure on the lack of disclosure here. And I think it's important to improve this, because I think improving it gets us better data as consumers of the information for purposes of research and modeling and other activities. And so I was a little surprised to see this partition, and I do think that's a pretty significant takeaway here. So I'll turn it back over to you, David. But pretty interesting insights, I think, coming out of this from a financial and a regulatory perspective.
Thanks, Derek. So beyond just the overall cost, there's the question, I believe there's even some commentary in the chat about, what are the elements that lead up to that total loss? So you see something like a $5 billion loss for Facebook, and what are the elements that contribute to that? Because understanding where the losses occur is a necessary step to actually being able to manage those, both from a remediation and mitigation perspective. So we broke this down into a number of categories, some of which are not surprising to us, and some of them are surprising to us. On the not surprising side, in terms of just the number of times that we see this mentioned, response costs are really, really common. There is a lot of good information out there, or better information out there at least, on how often a loss is associated with some sort of response. This would be in the incident response, the hiring of incident response, the allocation within company filings about reserves, et cetera there. Just behind response costs comes the productivity or revenue loss. Again, probably not a huge surprise in terms of how often that occurs. But then going down the list, you see fines and judgments, which are not dominate. So one of the things that we were looking at, and we talk a little bit more in the report, is the effects of GDPR on fines. Sneak peek, there is not a huge exhibited effect of GDPR out in our extreme events out there. It's not to say that there won't be, but we haven't seen it to date. What is interesting, however, is when we look at competitive advantage and reputation damage. So from my time as a enterprise defender working in organizations helping to identify and manage risk there, this competitive advantage or reputation damage in terms of soft costs comes up a lot. And we were really excited to go into this and try to find out how our organizations allocating costs. Well, to our surprise and frankly, a little bit of disappointment there, we found no hard evidence of competitive advantage or repetitive damage losses in quantitative dollars. Organizations just aren't mentioning this in their SEC filings, in any sort of conversation, that they're actually putting dollars associated with it, at least for these events that we've looked at so far. This isn't to say that those things aren't real, they aren't significant, but there is not data yet available on this. And this was something that I had hoped to look for. And I think, Wade, you had expressed a similar thing as well, is that we hoped to get there, but just didn't get there with this.
Yeah, I think this is a good candidate for future research for sure.
Absolutely. So with the categories that we did find, what is the magnitude of those losses? And for those of you that are quantitative risk analysis, you may think of terms of the types of losses that are in like a FAIR framework, but this is not limited to a FAIR application there. When we look at the different types of losses, productivity of revenue, replacement, response, fines and judgments, we see some variation amongst those, which is good. It shows us some information. So these 4 types of losses are ranked by their median or typical losses, but they're also ranked, rather coincidentally, by the amount of variability. So you see something like productivity or revenue loss. That leads the pack at a typical productivity loss for an extreme event of $68 million. If you compare that with something like a typical fine and judgment of on the order of the magnitude of $21 million, you'll see that yes, it's much smaller, about a third the size of productivity or revenue losses, but the spread is huge. And this is actually on a log scale there, and that we have some events that have huge losses. You might think of your Cambridge Analytica, your Facebook fines, et cetera. And then we have some fines that are relatively trivial for some firms there. And that's really significant in that you can think about what the typical is, but when we're talking about extreme events, the typical may not always be the best measure. What is also interesting is this concept of poor incident response. As we were going through a number of these events, we were able to find some very clear indicators of firms that, as a security practitioner, would say, you know what, this firm just didn't have a good day on the crisis management. They did not have a great incident response to this there. And we were able to identify some clear signs of when a firm had a poor incident response. This would be indicated by things such as government hearings, calling a firm to account. This would be firms that had to retract their findings several times. Certainly a volume of activity in the press, decrying an organization's response there. We're not here to name and shame, but we are here to show that there is a difference in that, and that the firms that had no observed sign of poor response, so we don't have clear evidence that they had problems during response, their typical losses from a median perspective was around $39 million. The ones that actually had clear indicators, their typical losses were $109 million. Now, we're not claiming that this is causal, not saying that if you bungle the response, you will have 3 times the size of the typical loss of your competitors and your other organizations, but it is really interesting to know a correlation. We think there is really important evidence to show the importance of having good crisis management and good incident response practices.
And one thing I'll call out, David, about that chart is if you notice, each of those billion-dollar losses are in that known problems and incident response category. I view that as kind of an indicator, right? That's the group you most don't want to be among. All right, I think I'm up for the next one. So let's talk about that. So we've talked losses, we've talked categories of losses, and now let's talk categories of events. What kinds of events were these? And we slice that a few different ways in this report. Now, what you see here is actually a way that the folks at Visible Risk and Derek like to view the world, and I've seen this in several other places as well. You have these 3 broad categories of events. It's a business disruption event, it's a data disclosure, it's a fraud type of event. I think this, Derek, correct me if I'm wrong, but when you're talking to boards or other executives, they may not need to know all the nitty-gritty details about what occurred, but this is kind of meant to be their language. Do you have anything to add or correct about that?
I think that's right, Wade. I think this is a way that folks who aren't as close to this topic as all of us are like to think about this. It doesn't mean that there aren't other ways to think about it, and I think this is useful because it's easy to link this back to more established frameworks around this, like the Basel II framework. So I think we think about it that way because we think
that's
how boards and chief risk officers think about this.
Yeah, and for me, organizing the data this way kind of gave me a realization. And as some of you know, I've spent a long time studying data breach events or data disclosure events, and to see that they're kind of the tiny peg in in this lost tent is interesting. You know, clearly the business interruption events, and this is where I mentioned earlier, you see the weight of NotPetya and those kinds of events felt at 9.6 billion in total losses for those kind of events. But you know, the fraud events and data disclosure, I'm not saying a billion is anything to just dismiss. But it's definitely not as much. Now, if you look at the median, it's kind of a different story, right? Those data disclosure events tend to have the largest median loss. So you know, depending on the way you turn this data, you kind of get a different perspective on what types of events cost the most, you know, and all of those kinds of things. So this is one way to do it. Let's look at a different way that we can also actually, yeah. Before we look at a different way. Sorry, it didn't memorize the order of slides here.
It's okay.
Kind of going on the theme of disruption and NotPetya and so forth. We tried to identify the actors. We were not trying to do attribution in this report. This is not an attribution report, but we did try to get the type of actor. And if you're familiar with Verus, there is a actor variety for state affiliated group, organized criminal group, there's activist groups, so on and so forth. But by far, state affiliated and organized criminal groups were the most active in these extreme events. You know, you can, every dot is an event, and the organized criminals were behind the majority of the events. But, you know, if you look at the losses associated with these, the state affiliated group had a larger median loss magnitude, 114 million versus 30 million for the organized criminals. And then again, if you look at that $1 billion mark, the state affiliated incidents tied to state affiliated actors were the biggies. If I recall correctly, if we tally up all the losses attributed to state affiliated groups, it's like 43% of all known losses in this report, which to me is just astounding. Again, going back to former work I've done with Verizon DBIR, you're just not used to seeing that much attributed, because the majority of data breaches and other things tend to be these organized criminal groups. But I constantly had to remind myself, hey, we're talking about the biggest of the big events here. And from that perspective, it makes sense that state affiliated actors make their presence more known than your standard security incident.
Right. And for me, this was really the point in the analysis where I realized that something's different here. Something is different with these extreme events, that once you get out this far, there be dragons. As an enterprise defender myself in previous years, I've always followed some of the conversations on APT, but have not been overly concerned with them, to be frank. I always thought, you know, to take a comment from chat, you know, when nation state comes after you, what you're going to do? Well, you're going to get owned. It was always been my thoughts, like that we were not set up to defend against that level of threat at some of the retail and other organizations that I have participated in. And to see that for these largest events, that the state affiliations, the APTs, if you will, factors so dominantly in here in terms of both prevalence and magnitude was a shock. And it's like, okay, maybe I need to rethink that language.
So now let's look at a different way to slice these up. Now, in the report, we call these incident patterns or event patterns, and just think of them as, you know, there's one of these assigned to every event. So we had 103 events in this study. We had 103 that we assigned one of these patterns that you see, and we did not have these patterns going into it. We experimented with some other categorizations that already existed, but we kind of found that there were groups of unique and similar events that just warranted their own label. So this is what we came up with, the labels that you see here. And on the horizontal axis, you're looking at the percent of those 103 events. And on the vertical axis, you're looking at the percent of all losses. So this is kind of your risk matrixy type of thing here. So in the upper right of that, things we put under hack or intrusion, someone hacked into a web application or a network infiltration, or whatever kind of thing you want to put on that. That was the most frequent, and also when you tally up the losses, responsible for the largest share of losses. I'll show you from a typical loss perspective in just a moment. But from there, you kind of get the sense like, okay, fraud or scam category, not nearly as common, but responsible for a lot of the overall losses, and ransomware and wipers kind of in there in the middle, right, in terms of both frequency and share of losses. And we use these categories in several ways toward the end of the report. So if you want more than this one view, you do have more in the report. Let's look at this one. So this is the same categories there on the left, but we're showing you the median loss instead of the share of overall losses. And it kind of tells a different story. The typical system failure, which was way down in the bottom left corner in the last one, such that you might just look at that and say, well, that's something I don't need to worry about. This kind of says, well, okay, let's hold on here. They weren't all that frequent in these extreme events, but they did have the largest median loss. You can see there's only 4 of them there, so make of that what you will. But this gives you a sense of spread. And some of these are fairly tightly grouped. Some of them are all over the place. You have some weird patterns like that fraud or scam. They're pretty tightly clumped around the median of 46 million, but then you have this multi-billion-dollar fraud or scam. That's Facebook, by the way. And this is just a different way to look at the losses associated with these different patterns. In addition, we did something, and this is one of the things I was very interested to do in these. This is similar to what you see done for the Verizon DBIR, where you have, these are not exactly Verus categories, but we based these on Verus categories, same taxonomy that the DBIR uses. So for all of the events that we studied, we tried to identify what techniques, what methods, what vectors were involved in that. These are not mutually exclusive, so something could use some form of credential attack, stolen password reuse, pass the hash, whatever, and then also could use that credential, the privilege gained with that credential to install a backdoor and whatever else. So these are not mutually exclusive. You can have more than one of these in the event. But it gives you a sense of how do these events occur. And I think if you took this list and you compared it to what something like you see in the DBIR, there are a lot of similarities. It's surprising that the most common method is credential-oriented attacks, largely cracked and stolen reused passwords. And the largest share, over half of all losses in this study, $10 billion, attributed to an incident in which that technique was known to have been used. And there's several others here that are major categories. You look at vulnerability CVE exploits at 8 billion, 22 events and totaling 8 billion in losses. And largely these were known and older CVEs. They weren't like 0-day kind of stuff. So if you just scan this list, my impression was just a reminder that we're not looking at futuristic, extremely sophisticated things we've never ever heard of, right? I bet nobody on this call is surprised that multi-factor authentication would have been useful in, possibly mitigating or helping to prevent a large share of these extreme events, right? The controls that we've seen time and again when we study incidents are still relevant in these extreme events.
Right. And this is really, for me, was the counterpoint to the conversation around crimeware and nation state, state-sponsored actors, et cetera, there, and saying, okay, maybe the actors are APT in nature, but it looks like the methods by which they're actually achieving these ends are not anything super unique, not super rare. These are things that we deal with on a day-to-day, work-a-day perspective. And it's great to see this come back again. So we did want to show at least one. It would not be a Cyentia loss presentation if we didn't have at least one mention of a particular bugbear of ours. This is something that's not in the report, which is this cost per record. Now, if you really want a full review of why a cost per record is a bad way to estimate potential losses or probable losses, you're welcome to read IRIS 2020. We'll be happy to have that conversation with you again. But I'll just comment here that if we look at the extreme losses, these are the ones that have, again, 20 million records or more, $20 million or more, some combination of that there, that they are a really bad fit for common cost per record metrics. I think, Wade, you actually like to call this scatter plot here on the records versus losses the 1880s US population map. Do I remember that correct?
It is, yeah. I see weird things in data sometimes. So yeah, that's what it reminds me of.
I can see Florida down there, and there's LA over there on the West Coast. I can see that. So, not to go into extensive details on this, and just saying that, again, if there was any doubt whatsoever, a cost per record is a really bad metric. If you want to replace that, our advice, once again, is to use about $200,000 is a great, got to have a number perspective, and go back to the IRIS 2020 tables for what those ranges could be, which are a little bit more detailed if you want to break that down. So that's kind of a whirlwind tour of what's in the report right now. Our intention is not to really replace reading the report, but to point out some things that we found particularly interesting there. But let's talk a little bit about what this means for practitioners out in the field. We've got some takeaways here. I think the start is, and this goes back to some of the conversation that's already taking place in the chat, is that IRIS 2020 and IRIS Xtreme are different in terms of the data sets they're looking at, but there's some commonalities. We see there that as things begin, there is the common things from credential stuffing, et cetera, there. Those still apply for Xtreme. But when you're looking at these large to large, you're getting into your particle quantum physics that are going on there. And there are some differences out there, such as the rise of nation states out there. And it's my opinion that when we're talking about nation states and APT discussions, what we've seen so far has been less about the advanced and more about the persistent. What we're seeing here is not the super cutting edge 0-day events out there. Those are probably still out there, but it's much more about, hey, I'm clocking in at 9 o'clock. I'm putting in my 8 hours of working for the boss man, and then I'm punching out after I achieve that. This is really professionalization of cybercrime. Wade and Derek, are there particular things that you want to call on this as well?
I'll pause for Derek to pick one. I have lots of them.
Yeah, I mean, certainly the last one is pretty interesting to me when you think about, what at least I think many of us hear, certainly anecdotally from insurers and underwriters about the volume of, attacks increasing, the volume of claims increasing, certainly the volume of ransomware increasing. This seems to be, at least to me, out of sync with what we're seeing on the public disclosure side. I think, again, that's largely due to the materiality question, and that's why we see such a small amount of events that get disclosed publicly. But I think the insurers are sitting on fairly rich data sets, and I do think there is a need for some kind of cooperative aggregate disclosure, certainly anonymized, certainly in the aggregate amongst insurance underwriters, because I do think the net effect of that is everyone gets better, right? We get to see, more holistic data. It's a bigger data set. I think there are ways that we can materially improve the ability to do research and modeling around this data. I think we can materially improve the dialogue that people have about it. We can improve things like which controls are more important to prioritize versus others. I think somebody mentioned what does that analysis look like in the chat earlier. And so all of those things, I think, are improvements that can be made if we just see a broader picture of the data, and certainly something that I think hopefully we start to see that happen over the next few years. I think it will start to happen because I think there's just a hunger for this among researchers, among the industry, and among practitioners who are trying to understand how to improve what they're doing to be more effective at preventing or mitigating these types of extreme events.
Yeah. I'll add just a couple thoughts. I saw a question about what do we mean by productivity losses are a big deal. That's just a reference back to when we showed that categorization of top level event types. Those loss of the business disruption, things like that, were the biggest category in terms of overall amount and share of losses. So those types of incidents definitely make a big impression on these extreme events, and seem to be becoming more common as ransomware, or the type of ransomware that some might call a wiper, and then other disruption-oriented events kind of are in vogue. One other thing I'll call attention to. I was pleasantly surprised overall with the event reporting. In other words, we could actually get some of the things that we shared on the previous slide. How did this event occur? Who were the actors? Those kinds of things. Again, it's the largest and most well-known events in many cases, so that tends to flush out the details. But comparing when I first started this 15 years ago, there was almost no information publicly available on events. So it's gotten better. But at the same time, in trying to collect information on losses, that was all over the place. We struggled with the SEC filing would claim one amount, and some news media article would claim another, and then there'd be some other source that gave an entirely different amount, and it's clearly this is messy. We don't have standardized ways to report losses. We use different words for the events. We use different words for the loss categories. Some organizations categorize losses according to how they paid out insurance, and almost as a financial accounting system. And then others are more about, hey, here's where we felt the impact, in categories that are more like those that we showed, that someone who's familiar with FAIR would recognize. So that's something I hope we can get better at as we begin to report the incidents and losses, so that we can all understand this a little better.
Well said. And I think we need to be very upfront, is that there is this gap between what we've been able to publicly verify and what we see reports of anecdotally, et cetera, there from, say, insurers when they're seeing claims. Getting access to that information is difficult, but we're continuing to work on that. And that's actually a great segue, in that there is a lot more that can be learned from these events. So there's much more in the report than we had time to cover here in this brief hour together today. But there's much more that can be done than we've done in that report with the existing data set. And we're continuing to maintain this extreme data set. We're already working on updating the existing events, because these events change over time as the lawsuits and additional information comes out. And we're looking to add new events out there, both from the past as well as more recent, such as 2020 and beyond. The exciting thing from this, and something new for Cyentia, is that we are looking to make this information available to the public for subscription. We're doing a lot of work on maintaining this there, and we don't want to just keep this as ourselves. We want this to be an available data source that others can use as well. If this sounds like something that is appealing to you, we encourage you to reach out to xtremedata@advisen.com, and they can set you up with all the information around availability of that data set. We're really excited. We'd love to hear feedback on what you're looking for as well. This is a living process for us, and we're looking to do much more of this. Speaking of doing more, this is a series. We now have Iris 2020 and its brother, Iris Xtreme. We are already creating our research agenda for Iris 2021 coming up in, well, this next calendar year. It's going to get here sooner or later. If you're
only 3 years away.
If you're interested in either sponsoring the Iris 2021 or contributing data or both, we'd love to talk with you. Please reach out to us at research@cyentia.com. So with that, thank you so much for attending. Would love to pause. We've got a few minutes left here before the top of the hour. If you have additional questions, please chime in. We'll answer as much as we can. If there are questions that you have been sitting on, please send them in there, and we will collect these all and put them into a blog post if we're not able to answer in our short amount of time that we have left. Give folks a bit to go through there.
I think we got to some of the chat questions, so that's
yeah.
good.
I think there's a lot of good dialogue going in the chat. It was very helpful. Glad everyone was engaged on it.
If you do have any more, we'll hang around here for a sec.
Absolutely. Afterwards, you'll get a post-webinar survey. We'd love to have feedback on what worked well, what didn't, as well as on the report as well. Okay, folks.